Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you on the show, man. Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you. Yes, my name is Bob Fantina. I'm an author, a journalist, and activist. I'm very interested in U.S. foreign policy, all of which I disagree with. I'm also interested in happenings in the Middle East. Settler colonialism is one of my main areas of interest, and so, of course, I'm focused very closely on what's happening in Palestine and also in Kashmir.
How'd you get interested in just focusing in foreign policy and also topics in the Middle East? Through the propaganda topic, which I'm sure we're going to end up talking about at some point, I started to learn more about Islam and kind of realized it was the same thing we did during the 60s and 70s with communism. And we kind of just labeled it as such. And then people have just kind of either feared it or just not wanted to understand it a little bit deeper. And I like to try and keep a balanced approach. So I talked to both sides of the argument, and then I learned more about Islam. And I'm like, okay, so we just did exactly what we did with communism way back in the day. And I think there are some reasonable things with communism that people were probably really afraid of that were different, but it's been a label to use on everything back then. And it eventually became to this point where it was like, now I got to learn about propaganda and realize what has been sewed into my head and what is the actual truth of the matter.
Yes, after the end of the Cold War, the supposed end of the Cold War, the U.S. needed a new big bad wolf. It needed something else to unite the people against and make people think this was a threat to the American way of life, et cetera, et cetera. And they chose Islam. That was a convenient target following 9/11, when zealots or extremists who were uh, Islamic us did the airplane hijackings and so on. But that doesn't represent Islam any more than voodoo represents Christianity. It's a perversion of it. It's an extremist version of it. But the U.S. uses that to unite people so it can continue its wars of aggression. Uh, those are sort of proxy wars now. The Saudi Arabian war against Yemen, which is brutal and the savage war that the U.S. is supporting. The terrorists supporting anti-government terrorists in Syria, the warmongering and saber rattling now going on towards Iran, and of course the continued aggression of the Palestinian people by Israel, all financed by the United States. So countries that are mainly Muslim are targeted because the U.S. government has discreetly said that Muslims are the enemy.
And do you know what the reasoning behind that is? I mean, I would the Palestine subject, whenever that gets brought up or something like that, I'm not too familiar on it. I've just had one guest that was very anti-Semitic in his views, and I did not agree with him at all. I am Jewish, so it was kind of like can't hate myself. I mean, I think we get to this point where we end up putting labels on something without fully understanding it. So I'm just curious. I mean, I know a little bit more about the Islamic terrorism, how that word's been kind of broad brush. Like if you ask an average American what you would label a terrorist, people immediately think of an ethnicity, and it's like that's not what it is at all. There's extremists, there's white terrorists, there's anything. It's an extremist viewpoint, and that does not make up, I would say, the majority. But somehow we've been conditioned to a point where I don't know if it's a fear thing, if it's we get scared and the government realizes they can use our fear to their advantage. I mean, how many actions were justified on the basis of basically nothing but calling something as a problem we need to take out?
Yes, exactly. And in the United States today, if a white man commits a crime, he's disturbed, needs help. If a black man commits a crime, he's a thug. If a Muslim man commits a crime, he's a terrorist. Same crime. But I want to comment on your question about Palestine, Israel. Criticism of the Israeli government is in no way anti-Semitic. There is no relation between the two. Many people who are very pro-Israel try to conflate them, but that is simply false. It's simply a myth. It's the government of Israel has been documented as apartheid by Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and B'Tselem, which is a major uh, human rights organization in Israel. The uh, the government of Israel is in violation of uh, many the human rights violations that it perpetrates on a daily basis are just astounding. So none of this has anything to do with Judaism. There are many people there's Jewish Voices for Peace in the United States and a sister organization here in Canada, the name of which I don't remember at the moment. They are very active in supporting the people of Palestine. They are not self-hating Jews. That's a term that had been bandied around for a while. I think it's lost any credibility it ever had. These are people who are concerned about human rights, and they are concerned about the human rights violations that Israel continues to commit, and they oppose those. There are people in Israel who are working actively for for justice for the Palestinians, and they oppose government policies. Again, they are not anti-Semitic. A lot of them are Jewish themselves, or are practicing Jews. I don't know if practicing is the right term, but they are active in the religion of Judaism, uh, and they have pointed out that the idea after the Holocaust, never again, wasn't just never again to Jews. It was never again to anybody. These kinds of injustices should not be perpetrated against anybody under any circumstances. And they're seeing many of the same things happening, and they're opposing it. So I've kind of given a long-winded response, but I want to stress to you and to your listeners that opposition to government practices in Israel in no way equates to anti-Semitism. There is no relation, no correlation whatsoever.
It's always been a topic that I kind of dusted my hands with because it's just so controversial. A lot of people, it's either really hardcore extremists, and not against the government, but just the way that they maybe phrase it or say something where it comes off very anti-Semitic. Now, I am 1/8 or like 1/16 Ashkenazi. I'm not religious in any sense of the means, but that's a Jewish heritage. But is it much like China and the CCP? Like nobody says it's racist for yelling at the CCP. I mean, the CCP does some horrible things with like Uyghur Muslims.
Hmm. And it is the same, but because Judaism has such a history of being persecuted, and it's a terrible history, and through generations and generations, and there is a very strong Jewish identity. That any criticism of the nation that has declared itself the homeland of the Jewish people and only the Jewish people, and that in itself is a problem, uh, can be seen as can be misinterpreted by people who wish to misinterpret it as anti-Semitic. But it would be the same as saying that if you're criticizing the government of Italy, for example, Italy is a mainly Catholic nation, well, you're anti-Catholic. It's just not the case at all. We have to look at and separate government policies from any other consideration. What is the government doing, regardless of whether it's a mainly it's the nation of Israel or if it's India? And I have um, many criticisms about the Indian government now with what the Hindu majority is doing in Kashmir. They're occupying it. They're brutally repressing the native Muslim population. This doesn't mean I'm anti-Hindu or anti-Indian. It just means that I'm anti-human rights violations, and that's what we need to stress is the human rights violations, and that's what's important.
Do you think that it's on purpose that a lot of these subjects that boil down either get like there's a large amount of people that were on social media for a while literally calling people racist for things that weren't even the definition of racism. They were just kind of saying the word outright. And it got to a point where the word kind of lost a little bit of meaning. Because I mean you could be Pepsi racist, you could do whatever. Like people were doing that. Um, and it just goes, man, if that's a tactic, that's a really good tactic to get something so controversial that people will never want to talk about it, or like you can't have a conversation about things and try and understand. Like people won't even ask questions to where, like anything that ever anyone mentions the word Jewish, I just immediately go, nope, sounds like an anti-Semitism thing and just step out of it, even though it could be a real thing about a policy issue that the government's doing or some government corruption that's going on. Same thing with like, I think we have more exposure on China, but it's like anything that can be one of these controversial subjects becomes a point to where we can't talk about it because of the factor you get labeled either racist or you get labeled as something like this. And I go, man, if you're the government and you're really questioning things that we're doing in, another country, like something to do with Islam or something of that sort. I think it was justified for a point after 9/11. Not saying it was. I'm just saying that people didn't question because there was this whole war on terror aspect of things. But then eventually, when people started kind of wising up and realizing it was all kind of BS, they started going, hey, what's going on? And then that even lands in controversial territory where there's like patriots out there that'll be like, you're a commie. I'm like, well, how am I a commie if I just am interested into what the hell we're even doing over there when we're spending so much money over there?
Yeah, and during I've done a lot of research on the Vietnam War, and during that time period, there was a bumper sticker, "America, love it or leave it." No, then there was a one that also became popular, "America, love it or change it." But there's this idea that you've mentioned that if anyone says anything that could possibly in any way be construed as racism, they're not going to say it. But there are things that need to be said that aren't racist. It's getting back to the Israel-Palestine thing. I am very critical of the new government as well as of the previous government. This has nothing to do with Judaism, but many people are hesitant to say anything because they don't want to be painted with the anti-Semitic brush. And I'm always stressing to people that that is simply not. It's just there's no comparison between the two. I will combat anti-Semitism anytime I hear it, anytime I see it, in whatever form it shows itself. Same way I will combat uh, Islamophobia, homophobia, anything else. But I will also combat human rights violations, regardless of who is perpetrating them. And so, what you said is true that so often terms get bandied around so much they lose their meaning. During the Trump administration and since then, I saw interviews with people who accused Biden of being a what was it they said a Nazi socialist. These are two contradictory terms. You can't be both. But they heard these terms, they knew they were pejorative, and therefore they're going to label Biden or Harris or whoever with these things. It makes no sense, and it does cause real viable terms to lose their meaning because it becomes so cloudy.
Well, that's like with Ben Shapiro. I'm not a fan of him, but they called him a Nazi, and I'm like, I don't. It's he wears his yarmulke. Like,
Right.
I just,
So this
I
is
don't get it.
mhm. It's the same thing about it's sort of relating to the old expression, "Oh, he's a self-hating Jew." Well, no, he's a, a, a Jewish person who disagrees with perhaps Israeli policy. That doesn't mean he's self-hating. It means he's looking at the policy and saying, "No, I disagree with this." That's perfectly legitimate.
I would shift this over to the Vietnam subject, something I probably know a little bit more about. A lot of that, like a lot of people, I mean, under rise of the underground press, a lot of people were speaking out about the Vietnam War, but there's still this like, I don't think, I mean, maybe back then they didn't have the transparency we do now about what our government was actually really doing and kind of messing up a lot of things in hindsight. But I mean, even if we had something like that again today, where there was a war and we were in another country like that, if you just take it back to times, would people still be divided as much as they were during the Vietnam War? I mean, that's I think it still would have that same division. There's still a large amount of people that have faith in whatever our government says and whatever they go to war with about is justified in some actions. I'm like, man, when they have to tilt the scales and then block a lot of information to justify an action of war, I mean, there's many reasons to go to war, but I think that's something you should probably look into a little bit more. And with that Vietnam subject, whenever I talk to like Peter Kuznick, who wrote an Untold History of the U.S., any other person that studies Vietnam War, and they talk about the horrible things that happened over there, you get labeled like are you a communist? It's like that doesn't mean they're a communist. It's just it's propaganda to brainwash you kind of in the sense of like whenever someone defends maybe the opposing view or another country's view, it's like you just lost home field advantage or it's like a sports team argument. If you are from Baltimore and you're not worshiping the Ravens, then you're just you're a betrayer of your own country, you're a betrayer of your own land. It's like that's not what that is. It's just there's a different view or you maybe like some other aspect that's going on or maybe you have some information on a different perspective.
Yes, and this gets into the idea of propaganda and a lack of transparency and outright lies. Remember, prior to the invasion of Iraq, the Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the United Nations and said that he knows that the Iraqi government has chemical weapons, and he held up a small vial. And so there's enough here to destroy all of New York or something. And it was all lies. None of it was true. The war lasted about 4 years. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found, but people supported the war, and they support the troops. We always have to support the troops. No, we don't. Um, I interviewed for one of my books a couple of people who deserted from uh, the U.S. military during the Iraq invasion because they had been involved in it, and they saw this is just wrong. This is just wrong, and so they then deserted and served time in prison because of it. But the United States didn't want them to know these things. It's when you think of the crimes, quote unquote, that Edward Snowden or Julian Assange allegedly committed. What they committed was they exposed what the U.S. was doing. They exposed U.S. crimes, and they have been ostracized and charged and really persecuted because of this, because the U.S. government doesn't want the people to know the reason behind its geopolitical goals. It's always power and profit. You mentioned the Vietnam War. That was a situation where the the North was communist, the South wasn't, and they were reuniting. And the U.S. couldn't allow that to happen because no U.S. president can ever be seen as so-called weak on communism. So they inflated and exaggerated the Gulf of Tonkin incident to escalate that war, which lasted years, killed at least 2 million Vietnamese people, and the U.S. ultimately basically surrendered. It never should have been involved in the first place. But even prior to the invasion, during the Eisenhower and Kennedy years, the U.S. was sending money and was training insurgents in Vietnam, which was a violation of international law. So the fact that some people want to expose what the U.S. is doing is not something that can be countenanced by the U.S. government.
When it comes to propaganda, do you focus more what happens domestically or what happens more overseas?
Most of my study, and in the book that we're talking about a little bit today, was U.S. propaganda, but it's propaganda happening in the United States towards U.S. citizens, although it has an impact on U.S. allies too, as U.S. citizens support whatever war, whatever invasion and war the U.S. Comes up with, whatever sanctions it implements around the world. For example, right now in Iran, the U.S. is has sanctioned Iran very brutally, and it's having a major impact on the Iranian government. This, of course, is in violation of the JCPOA, which was the agreement the U.S. signed with Iran and a few other countries back in 2015. But as the U.S. points out or tries to highlight Iran as a major problem and as a threat to peace and everything, U.S. citizens buy into it, and it certainly seeps over into U.S. allies. Oh, the U.S. allies, European allies can say the U.S. is opposed to everything Iran's doing. The people of the U.S. know how horrible Iran is, et cetera, et cetera. These are all lies, but they get to be believed outside of U.S. borders.
I might have the unpopular opinion in this, but do you think that it's media capture when it comes to the way our media reports things? Like whenever they talk about something, if they talk about a crucial issue, or if it's propaganda of saying something about Iran, I mean, they were critical on Ukraine for a very long time before this whole thing broke out, and they immediately flipped the whole 180. But they'll say things like the Democrats want you to be soft on this, or the Republicans want you to be hard on this, and it's like there's a healthy balance somewhere in the middle, but everyone's like they're talking about an issue and what we need to do as a country to go invade another country or to go handle a foreign problem or something like that. But then they blame it on like nobody's pointing out the real like what's the real justification for that action. They immediately just go to and what the Democrats don't want to tell you or what they're I don't vote, I don't do any of the Republican Democrats. So I'm like impartial in this. I believe deep state, 100%. I'll die by that sword. But I just believe in a deep capitalistic system, and I think you can kind of look at like the way media reports things. And I think with media, they tend to blame it on the other political side rather than focusing on like what the hell is the point of even being in that country in the first place. Like I would always say that America should probably take a seat on the bench for a little bit because we seem to be evolved in a lot. And like I said, that's an unpopular opinion amongst most people.
But I believe it's the truth that the United States is interfering and has for its entire history interfered around the world to the detriment of the countries it interferes in, and often to the detriment of the people of the United States, but not to the wealthy. So, what you're saying about this polarization between Democrat and Republican, and the media, the media fostering that and encouraging that during World War II, for example, the media got news stories from the U.S. government and said unnamed sources say such and such. So it was just the U.S. government propaganda saying what the U.S. government wanted people to know. So these unnamed sources were the U.S. government. And the one of the things that the U.S. is saying now is that the government of Iran is a destabilizing force in the Middle East. Well, look at what the government of the U.S. has done in the Middle East right now, continuing to support anti-government organizations in Syria, supporting the war in Yemen that I mentioned before, uh, uh, supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinian people, overthrowing the government several around 2005, I don't know the exact year off the top of my head, of Egypt because it was too pro-Palestinian and not sufficiently pro uh, Israeli. In 1953, the US overthrew the government of Iran, which is a democratic elected government, and installed the Shah of Iran, who served for 2 decades, brutally oppressive to the people. They finally overthrew him in the 70s. But this was the United States causing interference, causing instability throughout the Middle East. It's not Iran that's responsible for instability in the Middle East, it's the United States. So, as you mentioned, the United States needing to take a back seat or sit on the bench for a while, it should do that permanently. The United States is the only country that has ever used nuclear weapons, and yet it wants to determine who can and can't have such weapons when it is in no position to say that. The United States has been at war for most of its history. Its 200 plus year history. There's been very few times it has been at war either directly or involved in supporting wars of other countries. So it's a very violent and warmongering nation. And in order to maintain that, to maintain the support of the people, it must use propaganda to twist its actions into some that can be seen in some regard as noble. Those actions aren't noble at all, but it that's the purpose of propaganda, to make something seem what it isn't.
When I got into the history of propaganda, or at least found an interest into it, was when I realized it was influencing a lot more than I thought. Like I know a simple like magazine or poster of like a German soldier eating a baby is one thing. You can go, okay, I don't believe that. Obviously, it's not real. Um, and I've seen some things with, some during World War II versus the Nazis. There was propaganda that was out there that was good in only an aspect that it did help us realize that if a Nazi's being nice to you, they necessarily aren't really trying to be your friend. They might have other intentions at afoot, which was good in some cases. I believe that not every single one of them liked what they were doing. They kind of felt forced in a position. I've talked to people who are biographers on that. But if we talk about like a really dangerous example here is the fact of influencing movie scripts. I mean, the fact that the FBI chose their representation on screen, the fact that there was a lot of things that were going on the screen that really just either, I mean, brainwashed people into hating a certain thing. I mean, if you ever look up the history of the film Pearl Harbor, we had to go to Japan and justify some certain aspects that we have in that film. And there was certain things that we stood hard ground on. Japan was like, you got to cut that out. Small little adjustments. One was a person, and like in one of the scenes on the ship, there's a dude in the background that got lit up by a aircraft, just ripped up the smithereens, and Japan's like, cut that out. You don't need that. That's extra stuff. You don't need that. And it's like this weird kind of policy that starts happening where it's like, okay, we don't want to go to war over a film, but at the same time, we are hurt and we do need to make a film about kind of this whole incident. And it's going to be from our perspective. And I think, when you kind of start realizing, okay, so they influence scripts, you are more, I guess, paying attention to influencing in scripts now. Simple things like thank God for the Marines at the ending of Jurassic Park 3. Small little stuff, but then you're like, but what did this stuff get made into? And then you have the interview. The interview with James Franco and Seth Rogen is a funny movie, but did you know that they took that little thumb drive of that film and they put it on little helium balloons and tried to fly it into whatever China, and people plugged that into their computers and suffer major consequences. I had a dude that made a documentary about that, and I go, again, meddling in foreign affairs, and every country does it in each own, and I don't know how to stop that. It's probably never going to stop, but we have to also try and find a way to mitigate our damage here and our involvement in things. And that is a lot blame on military industrial complex in a sense. I mean, our intelligence agencies have been doing things. I mean, you can take it back to the J. Edgar Hoover days. The idea of a world police, well, that didn't stop. They had a lot of stuff going on, and nobody has really called them on their shit. I hate to say it like that, but it's the transparency aspect, which that's why there's many representations or ideas of people calling things false flags today, because nobody knows what to believe. I don't. You influence a movie script. I'm like, hell, everything could be fake now. My parents could not love me. It's probably true. There's a lot of things where I start going like, you need to get transparency in a lot of these aspects of things. I think that America needs to come clean on their shit as well as I believe other countries. I mean, that's not our duty to focus on what other countries are going to do to their people. We need to focus on us right now and try and find ways. I mean, be accepting, I guess, of people that come over here. I hate to say, horrible what goes on in China, but I really don't think we have any power of what that happens over there. We just have to make sure we do not fall in that same category.
I agree. The US needs to clean up its own act before it can be uh, extremely influential around the world. Um, and you mentioned that all countries engage in propaganda, and they do. And all countries are interfering in, or many countries are interfering in other nations, but none to the degree that the United States has. The United States has over 800 military bases around the world. They are there to pre- to prepare for attack. And that's far more than any other nation that has foreign military bases. The idea of the propaganda. You also talked about uh, what's going on in other nations. There are diplomatic uh, means by which countries can influence other nations. Again, I because the Israel Palestine issue is a major area of interest for me. The United States gives almost $4 billion in military and other aid to Israel every year, and Israel continues to steal Palestinian land, kill Palestinian people, imprison them without charge for years at a time. That could stop. The United States could use diplomatic steps and say, you need to adhere to a basic standard of human rights adherence. If you don't, we're not going to send you a check this year.
Well, we have economic sanctions we could be doing that we're not implementing at all.
Exactly, exactly. But the United States believes in might makes right. And if they don't like something, they'll simply bomb that thing until it no longer exists. And uh, that's the way it's always operated. 3 years ago, just a couple of days ago, was the anniversary. The U.S. assassinated General Soleimani, a very prominent and high-ranking Iranian general. His funeral was attended. Millions of people took to the streets in Iran. This was a violation of international law. It occurred on Iraqi soil. The general was visiting there. It also killed an Iraqi government official. But the U.S. government feels justified in doing this. We don't like a person, well, we'll kill him. Now, prior to the President Biden's election, and just for I didn't I vote third party. I live in Canada, but I'm still a U.S. citizen. I always vote third party.
Independent?
Uh, excuse me.
Independent?
I vote socialist,
Okay.
and the the uh, the Jamal Khashoggi had been murdered in Turkey a few years before, and uh, Biden said this is a crime, and the prince has to be held accountable. Well, things have changed recently. Oh well, that's not something that we're going to concern ourselves with. Um, a U.S. citizen journalist was murdered in uh, Palestine a few months ago, and there was at the beginning there was certain opposition, and the U.S. was demanding some answers, but that's all faded because human rights violations, killing of journalists. Uh, the U.S. prides itself on free speech and freedom of the press and so on, and yet these countries are killing journalists, and the U.S. is doing nothing about it. So the hypocrisy there is really astounding. But this is part and parcel of what the United States does in all of its foreign relations and also domestically. Look at the way the police force, the mainly white police force, kills and otherwise harasses uh, people of color and communities of color. And yet it doesn't change. Biden, again, one of his campaign promises was that would change. He's done nothing about it. So we're seeing just so much injustice internationally and domestically. Uh, and yet the United States, officials say the United States is a beacon on the hill. It's a democracy that's envied by the rest of the world. This is not believed outside of US borders.
This is gonna be a really dumb question, so feel free if you don't agree, don't agree. You remember it was a couple months ago, it was two journalists, one they got kidnapped or something like that, and then they were lost, and there was like oh this giant cry and video thing, news coverage of it when they returned home. Um, do you remember that at all?
I don't. What which was it in, do you know what country it was in?
I don't remember if I think it might have been Ukraine.
Okay, that makes sense.
But there was a reporter, a journalist, and there was like two guys. And I go, is this not like the movie with that? Who's that guy, the comedian that always hosts the Oscars or Grammys, and he's always rude as hell to people. He's a British comic. I don't. Oh God, I'm blanking on his name.
I know you mean. Keith, not,
No,
no, no.
you know who I'm talking about? Short guy. Um, he plays in a bunch of movies out there, but he starred in a movie that was the exact same scenario that the news was covering. And I just kind of looked at it and like I know the false flag term gets used a lot, but when I saw that live coverage and immediately they come down the escalators and it was like this whole like like it was like
Mm,
to me, I was looking, I was like, I don't know why in my head I think this is fake. I was like, I really don't know why. Like they immediately hugged the mom and then let go, hug the wife, let go, and then walk right over to the cameras and do an interview. And I'm like, well, hang on a second. I would think that if your plane just landed, you would be right there at when the plane lands, hugging them, not doing a giant show for whoever the media public and everything like that. And there was this large justification for we need to go over there and get those reporters back. And it was like, I don't know what that means. And I don't know, maybe that's me being conspiracy or me being skeptical, but how do you trust anything really anymore when you kind of look at everyone's kind of justification? I mean, all you need to do is show a missing influencer for 4 months on television who I've never heard of before then. And then it just goes away. And I go, what is going on? I don't know. Why is the news just covering this? And they covered it for months straight. I know, again, you don't have to agree. I know that's conspiratorial, but I'm just saying, I don't put it above them looking through the past of all of our intelligence operations and so much thing of regime change and divisivizing another country's population to stir up and overthrow one of their leaders, not because either I don't know, they actually wanted to overthrow them or just because of the fact that they were just looking for someone that they could do better business with, someone that agreed with more alignment of the US. And I go, if a country's doing that, US is doing that, then I start going, I do not put them above doing a show or doing a whole thing about this too. It's like I don't agree with Anderson Cooper. He had during the COVID pandemic the Las Vegas mayor on, and she obviously was ridiculous. But he said something. He was like, "Don't you want to follow like the protocols of China?" And she's like, "This isn't China. This is Las Vegas, Nevada." And I'm like, "Oh, dude,
oh,
what just happened?" And Anderson Cooper's like, "That's very ignorant." I was like, "Yeah, but you invited her on because you know that she's not as intellectually whatever as you are." I was like, "It's a show. It's like our debates. They're just a show. They're people yelling back and forth." And again, conspiratorial, but that's my viewpoint from things where I start going like, there's a deeper system at play here. And like, I don't think the president has power. I think they can do very visual things for people, gas prices and things of that sort. Sure. But I think when it comes down to like a Supreme Court person who's on the seat for life or people in the intelligence community that are there for an extended period of time, um, they definitely are the ones in charge of a lot of things like that, and then a capitalist system. But feel free to disagree if you disagree.
No, no, I don't disagree. There are 2 points. One, I want to clarify my understanding of false flag, which is, I think, close to yours. It's an event that occurs that is either made to symbolize something else, or it's staged, and it's completely false. Now, and
Cumia coming out of that basement.
excuse me.
You remember Cumia coming out of that base? Not Cumia. Was it, who is it? I don't think I say his name, last name right.
Well, let me give you another example. During the Gulf War, or prior to the Gulf War, uh, a young woman testified before Congress. She said she was a volunteer at a hospital uh, in uh, in Kuwait, and she saw Iraqi soldiers come in, take babies out of incubators, leave them on the floor, and take the incubators because they were needed for something else. This was quoted. Her testimony was quoted uh, in the halls of Congress, used to justify the U.S. invasion. It was all over the television screens. Everyone saw the Nariah testimony. So, and the war started. Turns out she was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador. She had visited the hospital once at some point, but just for a few minutes. She'd never been a volunteer there. She'd never seen uh, Iraqi soldiers there. She'd never even seen incubators there. She'd just been in the hospital for some reason briefly for a few minutes to see somebody or do some press thing, and left prior to the war. But she was brought forward as this innocent young woman who'd seen these horrors, and that was a huge propaganda tool, a huge false flag, huge propaganda tool to motivate the U.S. to get behind the war, and it was very successful. It was all a lie. It caused untold suffering, but it accomplished what the U.S. government wanted it to accomplish, and human rights, human dignity, uh, even human life is not important if it stands in the way of the US's geopolitical goals.
It's anything to do with kids. As soon as that people hear
Oh,
that
right.
kid's word, it's immediately emotion takes over, and then nobody acts normal when it comes to emotion. There's a lot of things that the public does that people see as like a, and I get it. I'm not a parent, but I get it. There's it's just issues and things of that sort that even when I hear something about kids, I immediately just go blind with anger sometimes. But then I also try and think rationally of like, where's the evidence to support a lot of these claims that end up getting made? I have heard that propaganda tactic before. But that's what I think it's like false flags. The reporter, whoever was on CNN, who apparently he got COVID, and there was this big opening of him coming out of his basement hugging his family, and it was all like a show. But someone had saw him a week before where he almost got arrested because he was in a fight with his neighbor on a new property addition to his house. And I'm like, look, as much as we can go, well, that's just CNN or that's just whatever. I'm like, no, this is how the world works. There's a pitch and a show that needs to be played. Whenever Fox News or CNN or whatever gets sued in court, they say we fall in the same category as entertainment, just like WWE. And that's how they get out of that. They're not really news, but it's like this idea of like, and I think it's the public's fault, to be 100% honest with you. I think we've accepted it for so long that someone, when they're behind a giant news desk and they're wearing a suit and tie, any information they say is 100% factual. And I see that so much. It's much like I would hate to relate it to like I would say like court stuff. Like there's a lot of things like when you look at like a court proceeding, is it not a game? Like it's winning and losing. It People will deny the evidence or deny the facts in a case if it does not fit their client's best interests, and other people will go to deny the other evidence of the case if they're looking for a prosecution or if they're trying to persecute somebody. So it's like it's just two people trying to see who's the smoothest talker. A lot of times, I mean, there's people that are wrongly convicted, and we can say that society issues and a bunch of that stuff. But as the general public, we kind of just accept, like, even with, we'll take it back to like a JFK subject, the Warren Commission. There's 13 blue studded cast people with giant ass resumes that barely did any interviews, but the public goes, look, their word is good enough for me. I'm like, that's us throughout society. We have always looked for some type of giant show or some type of giant full studded A team like cast that needs to give us the answers because you think that their opinion is so valid based on their past events. I'm like, look, I have 1,300 something episodes. I ain't going to put it on a fucking resume to be able to get a job. It's not going to work. So it's like, You know what I mean? So like I think you can consider some of it valuable, but there's a lot of stuff where as the general public we've stopped really the answers and the kind of the questioning that you were told throughout your educational system of like always ask a question. It never hurts to ask. Now it's like don't ask a question. You're a conspiracy theorist or that's not critical thinking. I'm like actually a lot of this stuff between conspiracy and critical thinking I can't tell the difference sometimes. It's much like the mob and the government when they're working together to try and assassinate Castro. If you mention a heart attack gun, people will call it a conspiracy, but we have footage of them showing that. And I go, that's like getting the public in on the discussion. So I think with society, there's a small part. I mean, even me and other people play as well too, of like, we need to kind of like examine things a little bit deeper and kind of get over this mentality that every president needs to be a Christian man or some type of aspect of this. I'm like, we're way past that, but there's still some old style notions that kind of seep through.
Yeah, you've made several very good points. Some time ago, I was reading a book about murder suspects and their lawyers, and often their attorneys don't even ask them if they're guilty because that's not what's important. What's important is getting a jury to turn them not guilty. And again, as you say, these are people with law degrees, and they may be very prominent, and therefore the public or a jury is going to believe what they say, regardless of what that is. With you mentioned the Warren Commission, uh, many of the members of Congress are millionaires, and they are lawyers, a lot of them, and so people look at people. Oh, they have money. They're so successful. What they say and do must be right. You also talked about news shows being entertainment. Just recently, Sean Hannity was interviewed, or not interviewed, he was questioned in a court, and he said he never once for a minute believed that the uh, US election, the previous US election, 2020, was stolen. And yet he and his shows, his programs, all have fostered that myth, and they've continued to speak it, even though he said he didn't believe it. So this is where the idea of entertainment versus news comes into play. But as you pointed out, people accept this as news, and they don't think. Uh, you also mentioned critical thinking, which is certainly lacking in so much of the public today. Uh, the evidence that the election was stolen is almost non-existent. The election that it wasn't, the evidence that it wasn't is overwhelming. There've been recounts and audits. Uh, Trump's attorney general Barr, who was a toady if ever there was one, uh, he said it wasn't stolen. But people are accepting what Fox News says because they see that as a trusted news program. Sean Hannity's up there, as you said, in his suit, in his fancy office, and so on. And so people are willing to accept that. But there is so much going on that is simply not true that people are being fed. And you need to look at it. When I'm in the books that I write, I try to find at least two sources for every fact that I come up with. And sometimes it's challenging to do. But if I don't find that, then I'm looking to see if maybe this fact that I found isn't in fact a fact, and so I have to do a little more research and find out the truth of it. And if I find that it's not true, then I don't put it in my book. But it would be easy to write an article or a book with just one source that will agree with whatever it is that viewpoint that you wish to put across. And people read that and just accept it because the writer has a PhD after their name, or they're a former congressman or former senator or something, and that gives them prominence and a stature that they often don't deserve.
I'm a patriot at heart. I really am. I am also very critical of a lot of the horrible things that do go on. And I get it. It's like, you're looking and I have so many friends of mine. Most of my generation is probably falls more in like the burning heart liberal category where it's like being an activist and throwing paint on a fucking painting. Talking about climate change. Like I get it. There's issues that we need to talk about too, but I think, you got to boil it down to what's deeper than that. And just saying it's your president, that's the problem. I just don't think that we need to look at all media outlets. We need to look at everything of how we're receiving information in society. There's never this idea of objectional. I tell anybody if I say anything, look it up. Go look it up. Go find it. I've talked to plenty of people with varying different opinions on things. It makes it fucking hard to have a conversation sometimes, but it helps form a more balanced opinion on things. And I think like when I start bringing up things of like the church committee, people go, "Oh, church committee exposed so much." I was like, it was a whitewash. I was like, this idea that our government's incompetent is a joke. Don't say they're incompetent, because who pays the price? Nobody pays the price. During the church committee, they were like, "Can we like publish your CIA budget to like the people? We don't think you need to do that." Okay, all right, thank you. And they write it down. I read the 600 and something pages of the church committee report and influencing academia. So many stuff on there. And people always bring up they talked about the Kennedy assassination in the church committee report. No, they didn't. They talked about the Castro assassination attempts. They didn't talk about Kennedy assassination. They talked about the mob involvement. But even then, no agency besides William Colby embarrassing the agency's reputation. And that's everything has been trying to solidify this image of red, white, and blue. And I'm like, and that's why there's a big thirst for people out there wanting to expose the horrible actions that the government does, and for good reason as well, too. But I don't believe it's the complete 100% tear all opposite way either. I was like, you got to find a middle ground here. You need to understand what your intelligence communities are doing and what your government's doing, and you can't destroy the past. You can tear up the history books, but you can't do anything about that. What you can do is make sure it never happens again. And a large amount of people, my generation, the burning heart liberal type I'm talking about, it gets a little bit difficult when I'm trying to talk to like my nephew. My nephew's like, "Yeah, the FBI is terrible." I'm like, very true. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again because it's still going on. You can't just say destroy the history books and delete all that recorded past. I'm like, because that's our evidence. That's to show you that this is why you should be aware and conscious of what's going on around. And I get that's again another unpopular opinion, but I try and look at it from more of like, I don't have a political view here. I'm just kind of basing it off of my own morality and kind of human decisions when you start realizing that everything is kind of bullshit in a way. And I hate to say it like that, but when you start looking at Islam a little bit more and a bunch of other things a little bit more, you start going, what the hell is this Christian ideology? What is this idea that America is the only country, like Superman only protects America? Come on, like go a little bit deeper than that. There's a world viewpoint aspect that you're not seeing.
Definitely. And you mentioned the idea of the US being the world policeman and all this and the Islamophobia and the hatred toward Islam. And when Ukraine was invaded, there were broadcasters that actually said, this is shocking. These are white Christians. They look like us. This one reporter said they drive cars like us. They watch Netflix. This isn't like a Middle Eastern country that's always at war. And I was shocked that reporters thought that was acceptable to say that the invasion of a mainly white Christian nation and Ukraine, I'm told, is pretty diverse. It's not mainly white Christian, but to say that just shows an inherent racism, a built-in racism that it came across very strongly in that case. But how often does it come across more subtly uh, in on a daily basis? Think of all the Black men, women, and children who've been killed by the police in the U.S. And in almost all cases, the police aren't even charged. When George Floyd was murdered, that was filmed, and it would have been a little difficult for the prosecutor to say this was, or the police to say this was a justifiable action. But we see this subtle racism everywhere, and blatant sometimes, but subtle sometimes. And we see the press, as you mentioned, uh, echoing the government, uh, what the government wants it to say, and we continue to see this. So people aren't, as you mentioned, critically thinking. Look at what's happening in a lot of schools in the states when they're no longer allowed to talk about slavery because it makes people feel badly. And as you said, we can't erase the history. We need to learn from it because if we don't learn from it, we're going to repeat it. That's cliche. But people who are comfortable in their white suburban homes don't want anything to disturb their children in their school. And by saying that slavery was wrong and was brutal and was violent and was evil, and by saying that the there are still impacts of it that are in action today in discrimination in things like employment, housing, um, education. To say that that is still happening today disturbs people. And my thought is people need to be disturbed because that's the only way things are going to be changed.
Whenever I just very careful with like the labeling, kind of like the white, like the talk of white and all this and all that. Because it reminds me so much of COINTELPRO. I mean, COINTELPRO, when Hoover, what he really went further than just invading the Black Panther Party with radicals and things of that sort to get them paranoid and to attack each other. They were creating fake coloring books of black people beating up white people and cops and things of that sort and donating it to the white funders, sending it in their mail and having these people go, well, I don't want to fund this, and then pull out of it. Whenever we get to that discussion of like, obviously we know that a certain race and ethnicity is treated badly, but that's not just the only one. Look at the history of disabilities, people with ADHD that were getting. So when you kind of bring in like this discussion, and this is the issue that I kind of have, is that when we start talking about subjects like this, people go, and it's all white male privilege, and they go down. I'm like, look, if you want the white male or the public to get in on the conversation, you can't say that, because then people just throw up their hands like, I don't want to deal with this. And I'm like, this is a human thing. This is like, we're all people. If you can't see, I mean, because then it boils down to points where people look at my guest list, and I've had psychologists say this: is there a reason why you only talk to white men? I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? I've had 1,300 conversations. I've reached out to plenty of people of all ethnicities. I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at what you created as a person to do that. But that's what devolves into the subject when it just gets boiled down into race. And I go, you don't want to hinder another thing or bring down another one to try and make levels even or anything. You raise everybody up. We do that as people. That's our best option here. We raise every single person up, and we want progress. We have to look at it as a human subject aspect of things, and people that are abusing power because they can. That's been, might be a certain race throughout history. 100%. I'm not disagreeing with that. But look at prisoners, look at people in insane asylums, people that have no rights in the eyes of humanity, apparently, in society's view of things. And we're starting to turn those tides a little bit now. But I go, those people have been abused. They've been experimented on. Not just, I know people bring up the example Tuskegee syphilis experiments. Dude, there's so many more examples out there, and not just with certain ethnicities either. I go, to get like to start talking about it, you just realize this is a government that has had full reign to not give a shit about other people because they're not attached to them in any way. So they can abuse the hell out of their power. And now that brings everyone into the discussion. It doesn't matter if you're Islam, no matter if you're whatever. It's just about, we can identify as a nation just for the opening part of this, but as Americans, we got to look at the grand view of what we have and who we are as people, not political parties, not this, just human beings who have emotions and feelings, and we can have conversations about these topics. And like I said, unpopular opinion, but I try and examine it that way. And I don't really, maybe it's because my ADHD, I tend to look kind of past simple political things. I've had so many times either people yelling at me about races on my show, or people will tell me about like, you had too many Republicans on your show. I'm like, how the fuck do you know? Do you have like a dowsing rod where you're able to guess what they are? I just don't see that. I look at like a person's viewpoint in history and kind of just trying to examine that, and then talk to the other side as well too. But I don't think that's crazy. And I'm not the best at critical thinking, but I think that's pretty critical when you kind of examine aspects of like, as a society, we function together. We do better than together than we do apart. I mean, Abraham Lincoln's quote, "A house divided cannot stand." And that's what the government's really good at making us do, turning it into a political battle between two different sides, turning it into a race battle between different ethnicities, or having a discussion so damn taboo you can't talk about it. And that to me is dangerous. It goes back to the point about the anti-Semitism before. I mean, when you label something like that, there are people that are might be curious, but will drop the discussion. But when you explain, it's not being anti-Semitic, it's just talking about the government's issues. Much like everyone knows, we're openly talking about China's abuses or the CCP's abuses. And it's like, there's no double standards in this. You can talk about the other one now, but we've somehow brainwashed ourselves to believe that we can't talk about it because it gets labeled in a certain category of racism. And that word is like, I mean, it gets tossed around a lot, sure, but it still leaves people, dropping a topic when they probably should be talking about real issues that are going on against human rights.
And I think a point you made that I really like is that we can you hear me okay? Okay. Is that the we're all human, regardless of uh white or people of color, disability, sexual orientation, male, female, whatever. And the divisions that have been artificially created between many of these categories is one of the things that's damaging us greatly as a society. Uh, if all the police in the US believed that everyone was entitled to equal rights and had equal dignity, they wouldn't be patrolling neighborhoods of people of color more than white neighborhoods. Um, if the justice system believed that also, that in the inherent dignity of everybody, the U.S. prison population wouldn't be nearly as big as it is, one of the largest in the world. It wouldn't be overwhelmingly the prisons wouldn't be overwhelmingly filled with people of color, mainly black people. So this is a fundamental issue we have right now in the U.S. I say we, I'm still a U.S. citizen, although I live in Canada. Uh, a very divided government, and one of the divisions is that uh, people want people in power want to serve the people who look like them. And again, there is not a large minority population among the Senate and the House of Representatives, and this causes problems domestically and throughout the world. So this idea that you talked about fairness and equality is foundational to justice, and it's what's lacking in certainly the United States and in much of the world today.
We need to put more profit or more power into nonprofit organizations, people that are dedicated to, coming at it more with a balanced approach. Like I would never be president because I would never handle any of that situation. I would hate that. That's a curse that you put on someone to be president. Jesus, that's a tough decision. But even with FBI directorship, I mean, you can look at Hoover as a horrible human being, but also look at like that's a guy exposed to something he should never have been exposed to, whether it's his own personality or things of that sort. But you have secrets of people, you have wiretaps on people, you have so much going on. There's no way that does not corrupt you as a human being, where you lose many aspects of who you are. And I think, a lot of these burdens where we just place one individual as the person that holds the key to this, and then they kind of control all the other organizations like hands. I go, man, I feel like at this point, you got to kind of have like the balance, like The Hill, that show The Hill with the Republican news person, then a Democratic news person, two people, two opposing views that kind of talk about the issue and give both perspectives on each side, and the audience hears it and they kind of think of them rationally. And I think that's a good balanced approach. But also the number of nonprofit organization people I've talked to who have been, campaigning for certain issues that they care about. I was like, you just need people that are invested in actually making a difference. You have a lot of people, congressmen, I would say as well too, that have lost track of what necessarily should be right, whether that's blackmail or bribery or something of that sort. We all know it happens. There's plenty of jokes about politicians that if they were like a NASCAR person that had every sponsor person on their jacket, you
Yes.
probably lean to where
Yeah.
they voted. But I think when you kind of start examining, what we have as people and what power we have. I mean, look at the George Floyd thing. I think everyone was appalled by that, and there was a lot of rising up against that as well too. Um, and I think as people, we had power to really make something impactful and a difference. And we did. We got justice, for whatever you want to call that justice being. But I just think we have so much power, but right when we get to the doorstep, we end up falling back when something is small dropped right in front of us. It's like PETA, for instance. Like when people have issues with PETA. I do a little bit, but like what they considered a win was getting the animal crackers, the animals behind the bars. They just replaced the bars in 2013 and they considered that a win. I was like, dude, I know. Like they just gave you something very small. Are you looking to what they're doing? And I think in another country they were doing something with clams or something or oysters. They were taking shells of oysters and making jewelry out of. I was like, that's a real issue. You could have, went after, but it's just the small stuff. And I don't know. I mean, I think at this point, it's much like filing a Freedom of Information Act request. You're just happy if you receive something back. And that's not how it should be. We should be demanding transparency and we should be getting exactly what the people deserve. Is the government serves the people, not us serving the government.
And one of the things the government has done very well is convincing the people that it is not they who have the power, it's the government has the power. And it's really the other way around. If people could simply realize that nonprofits can do so much, but it's hard to get funding because they rely mainly on private donations. Um, but the idea that the government knows best is something we talked about this a little bit earlier, because they have the degrees and the look and the expensive suits, or whatever. Uh, the people surrender their power to other people who don't have their best interests. You also talked about the NASCAR analogy. Most elected officials in the US spend at least half a day, every week doing fundraising. So when the NRA or the American Israel Political Affairs Committee uh, gives them millions of dollars, and then legislation comes up that is favorable to the NRA or to Israel, those representatives are not in a position. They don't feel that they can vote what's right. They have to vote what's going to keep their funding in place. And as a result, the laws that are passed don't reflect the needs of the people. Fairleigh Dickinson University did a study a few years ago that indicated that the amount of influence that voters have on legislation is minimal. It's almost non-existent. But the amount of information that lobbyists, that corporations have is what's predominant. And that needs to change. That's why there are so many problems in the world.
I'm definitely not going to be able to solve it on a podcast, but that doesn't hurt. Definitely talking about it a little bit too. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's like once you start kind of learning. I was like, I get it why people just want to go to their job and take care of their family. I was like, what else do yeah, well, I mean, what can you do? There's just so much that's like ingrained into society when it comes to like government. That's like it seems like even every 4 years, it seems like it might make a difference to me. I've just lost hope in that aspect
No.
of things.
Yeah, I have too.
There's a lot going on, but I don't know. Maybe we'll see it with some people. I'm not saying spark up a riot, but I think enough people, you get enough transparency on some things, at least giving people the opportunity to question things. I mean, that's what scares me about the internet as well, too. How many topics are unfindable because they took it off of a search list or put it to the bottom of the results. And it's a, you know, hard navigated world, but I'm glad people like yourself have made books, kind of examining a lot of things, at least educate some people. But if you want to give a shout out to where people can find your links, your website, any other things, Twitter, Facebook, anything like that.
Sure. My website is robertfantina.com, and I'm available on Twitter, Facebook, and the usual social media sites as Robert Fantina.
I'm going to make sure I follow you on Twitter. I'm going to link all your links in the description. It's been a pleasure chatting with you, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.